I will just wait for everyone to join. Okay, I think we're ready to go. So welcome to everyone who's joining us from Zoom or through the Facebook Live. I hope you've all connected properly. If you've not, then just leave a comment or say something in the chat and we will try and sort out any technical issues as soon as possible. Today we're going to be hearing from a student at KI, Heloísa, who will be talking about her career in pharmacovigilance in a pharma company and at the Uppsala Monitoring Centre. The presentation is going to follow a format of around 20 minutes of talking, followed by time for question and answer. So if you have any questions throughout the talk, you can just leave them in the chat or as a comment under the Facebook Live, and we will make sure they get answered. Okay, over to you, Elo. Enjoy.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy. Well, thanks everyone for showing an interest in this talk. So I'm Heloísa, or Elo. I'm from the Health Economics Policy and Management program, and I've been working with pharmacovigilance for almost like 11 years. I used to work in a pharmaceutical company in Brazil until I moved to Sweden to work at the Uppsala Monitoring Centre. So I'll share a little bit of both experiences with you. But I think that it's also important to explain a little bit of what pharmacovigilance is. So I'll go a little bit into that as well. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them and we will talk about them later. So the first thing is that I don't know, I used to have this question a long time ago in my life. I always wondered, like, how would like this product, whenever you see like the leaflet of a drug or like a medicine, and then you see that section on possible side effects, have you ever wondered, like, how is that obtained? Like, how do people know about it? How they come up with these things? So this was a question that I had, and then life brought me into pharmacovigilance and I got my answer. So pharmacovigilance, according to an official WHO definition, is the detection, assessment, understanding, prevention of adverse drug reactions or other adverse drug events or any other drug-related problem. So it is not only about monitoring side effects, which is the same thing as adverse events or suspected adverse drug reactions, but it also assesses other aspects of using medicines that can have an impact on the safety of patients. So overall, like the aim of pharmacovigilance is to make an assessment of the benefit risk of medicines. So it's always taking into consideration not only the side effects, but also the benefit or the efficacy of a treatment. So you can make a proper decision on if a medicine is appropriate for use and to whom. And then, so it all started, maybe some of you already heard of this story before, the thalidomide episode that happened in the 50s or 60s, where some pregnant women around the world, they took this drug thalidomide while they were pregnant, and several children were born with a defect called Folksuniversitetet. So after that happened, like in several countries, some physicians started to share experience. So WHO took the lead to create a program where countries would share their experiences with adverse drug reactions. And that's how the WHO program of international drug monitoring was born. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And why is it important? So of course, like there was no structure in place to monitor these kinds of events when the Folksuniversitetet episode with thalidomide happened. So it is important to always have this continuous monitoring of the adverse drug reactions that are happening with the patients, so you can make a proper assessment if the drugs are safe. And it is even more important because like when clinical trials happen, we always hear about it, at least in our program, you have all the phases of development, but clinical trials are kind of like artificial. They don't reflect the real world. So when the medicine is approved and goes to the market, it's going to be used by different types of patients with comorbidities in different scenarios. So that's it's only in the real life that you have a proper monitoring of the safety profile of a medicine. And then it's also important to know like who is involved in pharmacovigilance, and there are different actors on different levels. So it goes from a hospital, a healthcare professional in the country, patients, and like all in this local level of a country. And then, of course, like many countries have a national pharmacovigilance center. I'll also talk a little bit about that. Here I show an example of Sweden, but I know like that at least like 170 countries in the world have a national center responsible for monitoring adverse drug reactions. So it's called the National Pharmacovigilance Center. And then on a global level, so as I mentioned before, WHO has this program. So there's also an oversight of the global perspective of adverse events with drugs that happen in different countries. So I'll start talking about the global, like the global level of pharmacovigilance and the WHO program for international drug monitoring, because I've been working with it in the past few years. So as I said, it was created in 1968, to be more precise, after the thalidomide episode. It started with 10 pilot countries. Sweden was one of them. And currently there are 170 countries, which means that there are 170 countries working on collecting data at their national level and sharing it with in this global platform created by WHO. So there is a global database where countries like share all the reports that they receive on adverse drug reactions and create this big pool of data that they can use to assess the frequency of adverse reactions and see if there's any potential issue that happens. So this platform is called Vigilize, and it is a tool accessible for the National Pharmacovigilance Centers only. But if you're interested, there's also a simpler version of this database called Vigilize, where you can make consultations. You can enter an active substance, and then you can see the frequency of adverse drug reactions that happened all over the world based on the data that is contained on this global database. And I've been talking a lot about databases, so that's where the role of the Uppsala Monitoring Centre comes into place. So, of course, WHO has the responsibility for the program and creating policies and setting like the strategies for the WHO program, but it also the program also has some collaborating centers. So collaborating centers are a type of a structure that WHO has. There are actually like 700 collaborating centers for different aspects of health. But for pharmacovigilance, there are, I think, 3 or 4 currently. And one of them is the Uppsala Monitoring Centre. So we are, because I still work there, it's a small organization. It's a non-profit foundation in Uppsala. And so we have this role of being the WHO Collaborating Center for International Drug Monitoring, and we've existed since 1978. And we are responsible for doing the operational part of the WHO program. What does that mean? So one of the things is that we develop softwares, and we are the ones responsible for creating and maintaining that global database that I mentioned, which is accessible through Vigilize. So we have direct contact with the national pharmacovigilance centers, which all like pretty much like the ministries of health or drug regulatory authorities of countries, to help them in setting up the national structure on how they're going to collect data. We offer Vijay Flow, which is a system to be used as the national database for pharmacovigilance. So we support them in creating and setting up this collaboration and this data gathering, and also teaching them on how to assess the data, how to work with pharmacovigilance on the national level. So I've been working mainly, because I come from Brazil, I've been working mainly with Brazil, of course. other South American countries, and some African countries. But I work in a team with, we're 6, 7. So we kind of have like the world divided between us. So each one of us is responsible for dealing with a group of countries. And we maintain this relationship on a daily basis to check if everything is working well, if there's anything they need to improve. We also make improvements on the tools that we offer. So as I mentioned, like the Vigilize, the Vijay Flow, which is the database, the system that countries use. And I think there are more than like 90 countries in the world that use this system as their national pharmacovigilance database. So we are also like an important player in the pharmacovigilance setting all over the world. We do a lot of teaching as well. I'll show you a little bit of the trainings that are accessible if you're interested. So we also do a lot of this capacity building in pharmacovigilance on the global level. And I've been talking about national pharmacovigilance centers. So what are those? So almost like several countries appointed an organization or a group in their countries that is responsible for, that gets this responsibility of monitoring adverse drug reactions in the whole country. So many countries choose the Drug Regulatory Authority. So for example, the FDA in the United States, Anvisa in Brazil, the Medical Products Agency in Sweden, TGA in Australia, PMDA in Japan. So this is like the most common scenario, but there are some other countries that also appoint other centers as their national pharmacovigilance centers. So there's a LAREB in the Netherlands and the Toxicology Center in Morocco. So then, of course, like if they're out of the regulatory authority, they also need a very good collaboration with their local authorities to maintain a good, a proper assessment of the safety of medicines. And then trickling now down to the local level. So I'm dividing here, I'm giving a little bit of more emphasis on the industry side of things, because that's where I have more experience with, but also because I think that this is the most common place to get a job in pharmacovigilance, or at least to start your career in pharmacovigilance. So it's quite common to see job openings for dealing mainly with like the receiving information in the company and doing all the case processing of collecting, assessing, and reporting the adverse drug reactions that the company receives. But it is also important to mention that, so in many countries, there are regulations in place to control the pharmacovigilance activities of pharmaceutical companies. And yeah, like companies, overall, like companies do comply pretty well with it, I think, especially multinational companies. So companies do take it seriously. So the most important thing is that the companies are required to have an internal system in place to make sure that they are monitoring the product safety properly. So there's a lot of documentation that has to be in place. All the employees in the company, like no exception, everyone must be trained in pharmacovigilance. Everyone must know like what to do if they are ever informed about a suspected adverse drug reaction with a product from the company. And it is also, there can also be audits or inspections. The company can offer internal audits to make sure that that they are complying, that they are doing everything that they should. But the regulatory authorities can also inspect companies to make sure that they have the proper system in place. Then there are also routine activities of collecting data and processing them. So companies have their own databases of pharmacovigilance where they gather, so let's say like a multinational company. They have their offices in different countries. Every country has its own, every like office in a country has its own structure of pharmacovigilance, but they all enter data in one single database. I hope I'm making sense of it. But so on a daily basis, each country office of a pharmaceutical company is responsible for doing this, like receiving information, entering the database, and following the whole process. And they usually also have the obligation to report back to the regulatory authorities. So it is required in many countries to report, let's say, all the serious cases or like death cases that happen with the medications. So the regulatory authority also receives these relevant information. And there's also a lot of interaction on the day-to-day in a company with other areas. So with customer support, that's the main source of receiving information from patients mainly. And also like all the activities that a pharmaceutical company does that has the potential to have any interaction with patients or health professionals should take into consideration the pharmacovigilance aspect. So if there's any chance that someone might report an adverse drug reaction, these people must be extremely aware of what pharmacovigilance is and what they should do with this information. And then in addition to the individual reporting of the cases that happen, like if one patient dies, you have to report it to the regulatory authority. There are also the periodic reports which aggregate data. So all the information that you receive during a certain period of time must be reported this periodic report is generated, and this is also shared with the regulatory authority, usually whenever the license of a product is renewed. It's usually like 5 years or something, depending on the country. So overall, like this, in general, like the system, the company must have the system in place, and there are all these activities that happen, and they perform their own benefit risk assessment of their own medicines. And this information is always shared with the authorities. But then, so talking still on the local level, of course, there are other actors that are also involved in pharmacovigilance. So patients are important. They can also, they are always, they can always report like to the company. That's a main source of information. And in some countries, especially when the health system is not properly set up, so when there are problems in the health system, many patients turn to the pharmaceutical company to receive advice. That happens a lot in Brazil, for example. So it is quite common to receive reports directly from patients. But of course, that health professionals, hospitals are also an important player, and they can also report adverse drug reactions to the national pharmacovigilance system. And some countries, depending on how on the structure that they have for the health system or the regulatory system, they can also have like subunits on different regions of the country, so create kind of like a network of this national pharmacovigilance system. So it varies a lot from country to country. Yeah, so, and then how data is collected, that's an important part of pharmacovigilance. And there are two main ways, let's say. One that is called active pharmacovigilance, and one that is more like spontaneous reporting. So spontaneous reporting are the ones that people just present something, like patients present something, and they just report it to either the company or the National Pharmacovigilance Center or their health professionals. And then this goes into the flow and the pool of data from the national database. But there can also be what are called the active pharmacovigilance. So some studies or initiatives to proper and exact, like a specific group of patients, or some specific events of interest. Those are, for example, like the cohort event monitoring studies. So let's say that you know that a drug has the potential of causing a specific adverse event. So you might do a study focusing on that event. So make strategies to collect data with patients that present those symptoms or those events, and then assess the real risk of presenting those problems. And it's kind of the same thing with targeted reporting. So yeah, if you suspect that the drug is causing a series of events, you can just do a study or stimulate a certain reporting of specific issues. And yeah, so you notice that I talked a lot about databases. That's an important aspect of pharmacovigilance, because there's a lot of data collection on companies, the national level, the global level, and the WHO program. So one important aspect of pharmacovigilance, and I think that this is specifically important for the health information people, health informatics people, if there's someone here from the program, because there is an ISO standard for collecting data related to adverse drug events, which is this one that I'm pointing here. So because pharmacovigilance requires a lot of data collection, it is important that everyone collects data in the same way, or at least the same data elements, because then it's easier to compare data and easier to exchange data. So with this standard, everyone is talking the same language pretty much. And so it is a good aspect of pharmacovigilance. It's very well structured, but it's not easy for people who don't have this background on informatics or data science. So, but I think it's really interesting, and this is was completely new to me, and it gained a lot of importance in the past few years, because more and more companies and national pharmacovigilance centers are buying this idea of having databases compatible with these international standards. So it is a trending topic in pharmacovigilance right now, and it's getting a lot of importance and making everyone's life much easier. And then what happens with all this data that is collected in all these databases? So in addition to all the exchange between companies, authorities, WHO, so the main purpose, as I said on the beginning, is to make the benefit risk assessment of drugs. So there is a process called the signal detection. So after you have all this amount of data of the drugs that cause certain adverse events, you make the signal detection. So you review your database to see the cases that you have and the profile of the cases. And then based on that assessment that requires a lot of statistical knowledge, there are basically three things that can happen. So if when you do the assessment, you see that the drug is still fine, that it's not causing any problematic adverse events, so there are no actions needed. So the drug just continues on the market. But then if there are some issues that might potentially be dangerous to patients, but still the drug is relatively safe, what can be done, for example, is to have an update on the leaflet to include a certain adverse reaction as a risk. Or it can also be possible to restrict the use to certain populations. And then on more extreme cases, if the drug is considered not safe, it can be withdrawn from the market. But of course, this doesn't happen as often as people think. And yeah, so pharmacovigilance is not perfect. It's been in place since the 60s. But even though it's not, there's still so much that can be done. So one thing that is still a big issue is that pharmacovigilance is a world on its own, and people in the pharmacovigilance world are very passionate about it, but still a bit isolated. So one thing is that pharmacovigilance should be better integrated in health systems. One example is in public health programs. So countries have their vaccination programs or HIV, TB, hepatitis, where they offer treatment to patients, but then pharmacovigilance is not properly considered on it. So, or the program does the collection of adverse events on its own, scope of the program, and there's no sharing of information between a public health program and the pharmacovigilance system. So this is still something that it is still a huge challenge to overcome. And yeah, it's very sensitive because it touches a lot on politics and like political discrepancies between within a country. So it's, yeah, I think it would never be 100%. Then another thing is that, like, because pharmacovigilance covers adverse events and any other drug-related problems, there are several things that can be considered pharmacovigilance, but that are also covered by other areas. So, for example, medication errors are also covered by people who monitor the patient safety. It is another sphere of safety surveillance. Also, quality defects of medicines, suspicion of substandard or counterfeit products, safety of medical devices, or cases of abuse, misuse of medicine. So these are all, those cases can also be assessed or evaluated from the pharmacovigilance perspective. But yeah, there are other groups in regulatory agencies or anywhere that can work with these topics outside the pharmacovigilance scene. So it is always a bit unclear. And one other thing is, of course, lack of awareness. So I'm talking to you today. I don't know if all of you have heard about pharmacovigilance before, but it's still, a lot of people don't know that it exists, especially like patients and health professionals. Sorry. And then ISPOR chapter asked me to try to connect pharmacovigilance with the master programs that KI offer. So I tried to think on some aspects of it. So for us from the Health Economics Policy and Management program, pharmacovigilance can be important to integrate it. It should be integrated in the health system. So we have to keep it in mind for policies. And also adverse events can be considered as a kind of health outcome. And then it can also be like this aspect of adverse events is also applicable for people in the epidemiology program. Because of course, like pharmacoepidemiology is very well connected with pharmacovigilance. For health informatics, I already said about the international standards and how to do a proper data exchange between databases following those standards. For global health, there's the part of like integrating pharmacovigilance in public health programs, and also drug donation. Sorry. And whenever there's like a drug donation for countries, for like a donor or something, donors are also starting to think more about pharmacovigilance, and that countries should have the structure to collect data for the drugs that are being donated to a country. And for bioentrepreneurship, since a lot of people go work, get jobs in pharmaceutical companies, so always have in mind that pharmacovigilance should be integrated in all the activities from the company. Yeah, I think I passed a little bit the time, but I hope that it was okay. So I don't know if there are any questions.
Yeah, so we have one question in the chat and then someone with their hand raised. So the first question is, in the EU, what is the role of the EMA in terms of pharmacovigilance versus the national authorities?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So EMA has the regulatory responsibility. So there's a lot of collaboration between EMA and the national pharmacovigilance centers of European countries. So the national centers are responsible for assessing what happens on their own country. But then EMA is the one that has the, so companies in Europe report to EMA, and then the countries get information from EMA to make the assessment of benefit risk. Hope it's clear.
Okay, and then we have a question from Ahmed Salah, if you want to ask it.
Hello, hi Heloisa.
Hi.
I am Ahmed Salah, in Master of Bioentrepreneurship, and I have a medical background of Bachelor of Medicine, and I'm from Egypt. I'm just asking for advice from you regarding the pharmacovigilance itself, because I have a personal aspect and pharmaceutical aspect I would like to combine, and that's what I explained for you. My father is a pharmacist, and he is working. In his pharmacy, he doing pharmaceutical formulation for treatment of anal piles or fissures. It's from his intelligence or from his work as his effort, and he is the inventor of this formulation. I see that this formulation is distributed in Egypt as a very low scale. And when I graduated, I started to register it in the Egyptian Medicine Authority of Registration. But I found many complications and challenges for doing this, and at the same time, I'm being accepted at KI. That's why I would like to combine between start to register this formulation or work on this idea in Sweden. But the problem on me, I'm also in Egypt, was a senior business development and sales executive. So I know the medical side or regarding the health side or pharmaceutical side, and I know the last step of the process, which is manufacturing or marketing and sales. It's very good. But the missing part from me, which is in the middle, which is pharmacovigilance, sorry, how to prove that it's very good, or it's the signal is a green light to work on it or to cooperate with pharmaceutical company. The problem with me is that my knowledge in this point is zero, and I don't know how to work. If there is a map, I will execute very well, but the problem in with me in the knowledge or the map, you should make this, then continue to approval to distribute this formulation in the market. So contact for manufacturing or contact for sales, and I know this last step. But the missing part, which is in the middle, how to approve that it's safe or don't cause any harm or adverse effects for the patient.
So yeah, I hope, I don't know if I understood your question, but so the thing is that, like, I think your question is very much related to the process to get a marketing authorization in a country. I hope I understood correctly. So whenever a drug goes, so whenever a pharmaceutical company wants to get a drug in the market, it has to go through an approval process. So they send a bunch of documents to the drug regulatory agency. And one of the things that they look into is, so they look pretty much at safety, efficacy, and quality. And then if they assess that the drug, like based on the data from the clinical trials, if they think that the drug has a potential, is potentially like effective and safe, it goes into the market. So there is this regulatory process. And I mean, if you're interested in the area, you don't really need to have like a lot of knowledge about it. You'll learn a lot on the go. So when I started working with pharmacovigilance, I didn't know what that was. And I learned, on my work pretty much. But nowadays there are several courses. If you're interested, you can find any free, you can find a lot of information on free courses. And there's even a master's program that is online. It's called the EU2P. It's in pharmacovigilance and pharmacoepidemiology. It's online. It's a partnership with several universities. So if you're really into it, you can look for this program and get a bit more knowledge on it. So I don't know if I understood your question correctly. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that was great. So we have a few more questions in the chat. Some people want to know how you got started in pharmacovigilance, and on a related note, how you applied to the monitoring centre.
Yeah, okay. I started in pharmacovigilance a bit like out of luck, I think. So I'm a pharmacist. I was doing my bachelor's, and then we have to, in Brazil, we have to, we're having like a mandatory internship. And then I got an internship in a pharmaceutical company that was both, like at the same time, I was like part-time regulatory affairs, part-time pharmacovigilance. And then I liked it, and then they offered me a full-time job in pharmacovigilance. So yeah, that's pretty much how it started. But I've been fascinated about it since I learned what it was and the importance. And then how I got the job in Uppsala, that's a bit, it seems like simple when I tell the story, but yeah, I think it was a bit of luck as well, because I was already planning on moving to Sweden to study at KI, actually. But then because I had this background in pharmacovigilance, of course, I knew about the Uppsala Monitoring Centre. And then I was following, I followed their LinkedIn page, and they had a job opening that matched exactly with my profile, actually. And then I said, yeah, sure, like, let's give it a try. And yeah, it happened. So yeah, I'm one of those people that got a job through LinkedIn, and I never thought it would happen, but it did. But like one thing that was in my favor was that I was legally authorized to work in Sweden and in Europe. So they didn't have to take any risk in hiring me, like offering working visas or anything. So yeah, I just said, yeah, I'm willing to move to Sweden for it, and I came.
Okay, that's great. I don't know if we're going to have time to answer all the questions in the chat, but we will make a note of them and make sure they're at least answered on Facebook.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
We'll just go for now.
Yeah.
Someone would like to know a brief presentation of your kind of daily tasks.
At the Uppsala Monitoring Centre. Okay. Wow, that varies a lot. In the past, like I would say 2 years, so we made a lot of improvements on Vijay Flow, which is the system that we offer as the National Pharmacovigilance Database. So we prepared a lot of training for the new system, for the new version of the system. And there was a lot of like onboarding and ongoing communication with the countries to tell them that the system is coming, the new system is coming, what they should do about it, how to use the system. Yeah, so that's on a nutshell. I mean, that's what I've been doing lately, but it varies quite a lot depending on the demands that countries have.
Okay, great. So another question we have, sorry, I'm just trying to do this in order. A question about it, at Uppsala Monitoring Centre, what the percentage of each professional field of the people working there, like mostly pharmacists or?
There are lots of pharmacists, but there's a lot of people in data science, because they're the ones, and like software developers, because they are the ones like developing the databases and the systems that we offer. So yeah, mainly like pharmacists, a few physicians, and data scientists.
Okay, great. So someone wants to know, they're a pharmacist with experience in regulatory affairs and graduated from Uppsala in drug safety and pharmacovigilance, and are currently studying public health, and want to know where to begin to look for a job with these skills.
Yeah, I always think that like pharma companies are the easiest, because there are lots of them everywhere, and there's a big demand for people like to work in pharmacovigilance, and consulting companies, because a lot of pharmaceutical companies are using like external parties to do even like pretty much like the daily activities. So pharma companies and consulting companies.
Okay, and I guess this will be the final question. Does the National Regulatory Authority have the right to stop giving approvals if the PSMF of a company has the minimal requirements?
I guess so. I think it depends on the country and the regulation and the power of the agency. But yeah, in theory, I think.
Okay, so I think that's probably all we have time for now. Obviously, if you guys still have stuff to talk about, then you can put it in the Facebook discussion on the event. We hope very much that you will join us for our next events following Lunch and Learns that we're going to continue to add.
Here.
Yeah, there they are. So do let us know if you have any further questions. That was a really great talk. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And yeah, let me know if you have more questions. Yeah, I'll be glad to talk to you about pharmacovigilance again. Thank you, everyone.